Perfect. Well, thank you everyone for attending today's webinar on vapor management. This webinar is recorded and the recording is posted to the Code Adoption Toolkit, usually within a week or two, so just give us a little time there. But if there are any issues with audio, please write me in the chat. My name is Erica DeLello and I'm a project manager for Noresco. And this series is sponsored by the Colorado Energy Office with training materials created by Glenn Mathewson. So give me 1 second here. The chat's now enabled. I want to talk a little bit about the trainings that Glenn and I have worked to provide, just like this one. This is part of our Wednesday webinar series. You can see in the second bullet here that we've got 4 others that are in the series right now and hoping to add to that as well. So keep an eye out for an email from me as we do plan to add more. I want to also take a minute to highlight the role-based trainings that are new and we're starting to offer. These role-based trainings are a longer format and they essentially are geared towards looking through the lens of, say, a plans examiner or an inspector, an architect or an engineer. It's going through an overview of the energy code, and then it actually takes a real life project example and has interactive activities. So it's taking the code knowledge that you've learned throughout the session and actually applying it. For me, I'm a learn by doing kind of person, so these are ideal for that kind of user. And yeah, we offer these to anyone that's interested, and I'm hoping to set some up throughout the state, or we can set them up for your jurisdiction or company. We also offer one-off 1 to 2 hour trainings throughout the state. There's a bunch of previous recordings that and short video clips that are trainings that we've done in the past that is available on the Code Adoption Toolkit. We do offer technical assistance for code adoption. So if you're a jurisdiction considering adopting the 2021 IECC, we are here to help. So reach out to me if you have any questions on that, and we can get your jurisdiction from the beginning of just thinking about adopting a new code to actually implementing it and conducting trainings for your jurisdiction. So as I mentioned, there's this wonderful code adoption toolkit that we continue to add and update to. The resource that I want to highlight today is the Colorado Codes Helpline, and you can submit a helpline question on any of the building codes. So, and then we have someone like Glenn respond to you in just a couple days' time. So definitely utilize this as a resource. It's here to you guys. And yeah, I think with that, Glenn, I'm going to go ahead and say, we want to encourage questions. Please use that Q&A function. I'll let our presenter know at the end. You also have the ability to raise your hand. And then a survey window pops up at the end. So please go ahead and populate your responses there. It really helps us to inform what other trainings we should do and, any feedback. So with that, I'll go ahead and let Glenn take it from here.
All right. Thank you, Erica. Let me have a little bleep in technology as I get my screen shared and get my PowerPoint open, my messy desktop there. Come on. There we go. All right, now you're seeing what you should see. Vapor management, right? Hopefully everyone's seeing that screen and that's working good. So with that, I am going to click that little button. All right, so vapor management, what a boring little title here and what an interesting screen. I'm actually just pirating this off an original class I built probably last year, or no, more than that, about a year and a half ago, for the Building Science Symposium series happening across the country. And they invited a building code guy. And so the class was Building Science in Building Code. And it was all digging into how building codes really, truly do include intelligent building science. I know. Half of y'all are laughing. A lot of folks don't believe in the building code that way, and that there's actually well thought out, scientific answers in it. And so it was fun to teach that to these this building science symposium. It was all high performance builders, and getting them to open their eyes that really the codes, you know, the worst you can build and still be legal, people love to say. And that really casts the wrong perspective about the code. There is a lot more intelligence in it than the average folks will give credit to. So this transformed from building science and building codes into a vapor management on the IRC class, which is a full 4-hour presentation. Well, unfortunately, I don't get to have you guys here for 4 hours today. So what I've done is taken that 4-hour presentation and kind of went a little outside of the details. I elevated a little higher so we can get kind of a broad overview of vapor management in the International Residential Code. But again, my goal in every class I teach, honestly, is for you to leave with more questions than you got answers, because that's what's going to develop you as a lifelong learner, as an inquisitive person, and it's going to get you to learn on your own outside of just this short time we have together. So listen to the things I share about today, and if there's subjects within this broad overview that you want to get into more details, you can certainly ask me a question. Though I am generally prepared to just deliver you a performance for an hour, I will be paying attention over there for the questions. But you can also let Erica know, and maybe we can do some other 1-hour webinars where we pick one of the vapor subjects and get deeper into it. All right, enough of that. Real quick introduction. My name's Glenn Mathewson. This is just sort of a collage of my career that started as a laborer when I was age 19. And so I started about the bottom of the barrel that you could get in the construction industry. And that's probably one of my greatest prides, I think, in where I am in my career today, is where I started. But my focus is teaching building codes, assisting with building codes. I'm very happy and proud to be one of the professionals behind that code hotline. But my focus is the International Residential Code. I am an IRC expert, if you will. And so obviously energy and vapor management is all part of that. But what I love to do in my education is be sure that we don't put our blinders on. A lot of folks are really good at plumbing, or really good at building, or really good at the energy, chapter 11. And we have to remember nothing is an island in the IRC. Everything interconnects and interrelates to each other. So that's one of my roles as an educator. One of the things I'm good at is looking at the IRC as one complete code, all of the chapters together. All right, and the other thing is I'm a historian of codes. So this class is one that includes a little bit of history, not so much in this shorter condensed version, but the reason this class particularly includes a lot of history is basically all of the historical methods of vapor management are still options in the code today. And we've just built on that many, many more choices and options. There are so many choices that the free public gets to make when it comes to vapor management. And that's what's so unique about, I think, this subject. A lot of subjects have evolved over time and the old ways are gone. But in this subject, the old ways are still around. So with that, let's get started. If you want to learn more about me and what I do, you can go to glennmathewson.com. All right, so speaking of history, I'm going to start you by showing you this book, Building Science, right? This is all part of that building science and building codes concept. And this is a 1940s book. As you can see, it's for students of architecture. And there were 3 sections in this book: materials, structure, and equipment and occupancy. Now, 1940s, 3 different subjects. Yep, insulation and thermal management was certainly a subject in this book. But where do you think, and I'm not expecting you to answer because this isn't a live event, you know, it'd be a little different if we were in person, so take this rhetorically, but think to yourself, where do you think, which section of this book would the discussion and information about insulation be located? I'll give you a few seconds to think about that. And I'm guessing at least some of you probably said materials, because insulation is a material, but lo and behold, it's in the occupancy portion of this book, equipment and occupancy. Well, why is that? It's a material. Why don't we talk about it where materials are talked about? Because we don't look at insulation as a material. The average general public thinks of insulation in terms of their comfort, their convenience in the home, and of course the economics of it, right? How much are you paying to either create heat or remove heat, right? Heating or cooling. And so it makes sense that thermal discussions, insulation discussions have always been wrapped around these little critters inside the house and keeping them comfortable, convenient, and with good economics. All right, so come on, Glenn, this is a code class. Get out of your old architecture book from the 40s, right? But what is the IRC? It's really no different. It has these same subjects, doesn't it? It covers material, it covers structure, it covers equipment and occupancy. And I'd say this book is even better than that 1940s book because I had to pay for that book online. Whereas for this book, you can read all this information, all this knowledge for free, totally free. There's no tuition cost. There's no gatekeeping. Codes.iccsafe.org. And this information developed over centuries is available to you at no cost. So I always like to remind folks of that. For my government building of departments here, my building authorities on the line, let your public know this information is useful to them outside of government. It's an amazing book of knowledge about residential construction, and you can read it all for free. Let your public know that, please. All right, so same thing. There's a section of this book that's going to talk about insulation, and you probably all know where it is, right? It's chapter 11, which all comes from the full-size International Energy Conservation Code. So yeah, chapter 11 here, that's where we have our thermal discussion of insulation, keeping the occupants happy and comfortable. So let's go back to this picture though, right? This title slide. Thinking about the occupants and the needs of the occupant to have low energy bills and be comfortable. Well, thinking about the needs of the occupant when they're picking something to drink, right? Do you want a cold beer? Do you want warm coffee? Well, I like to put cold beer in a frozen mug because it keeps my beer colder longer and I get those little frosty beer freezy pieces, right? Or I put my hot coffee in an insulated type of mug because I want it to stay hot for like the hour while I sip on it, but I don't want it to get my hands hot. What have all of this been related to? Comfort, convenience, all about my needs as a person, right? And what do we ignore as the occupants, as the drinkers of the glass or the enjoyers of the warm furnace air? What do we forget? We forget the collateral damage, right? The ring of condensation left on our coffee table. Oh, if it's a thrift store cheap coffee table like I've got, whatever, it'll evaporate into the air in time, right? Or maybe you got a nicer one. You'll put a coaster underneath it to catch that water. But that's not a biggest concern to us, is it really? You got the coaster. You might yell at the kids for not using the coaster, but this isn't the focus when you're choosing what to drink and what glass to put it in. And that works the same when it comes to the houses. Where now in this old book from the 1940s do you think vapor management is going to be involved, right? The choice of our drink and our glass had an effect on vapor management. How did we deal with that, right? Coaster, let it evaporate, whatever, cheap coffee table. All right, now it's a building. And guess what? Our efforts to control the thermal movement through the building, just like the glass, are going to affect vapor management. But now, where do you think in this book the vapor management discussion is? Because, oh, yes, it was discussed in the 1940s. This isn't a new topic. Where was it? It was in the materials section, right? Totally separated and not even in the same place as the thermal discussion. The thermal discussion about insulation, not even focused on material, but all about the occupant. And so we can see this disconnect here where condensation and temperature all go hand in hand, but yet they're different concerns, right, in how we lay out these books. And guess what, guys? It's the exact same thing with the IRC. And this speaks to what I was saying about it's really important when you're working in the IRC to put out the effort to be that lifelong learner and keep seeking to learn subjects that might not be your niche subject, because everything has to work together in these homes. And the IRC puts it all for you in one book. So for example, when we get into vapor control, we're not in chapter 11. Chapter 11 is about energy conservation and effective use of energy. Right? But the temperatures are related to condensation. So chapter 4, we get this section called underfloor space, and we get a section called moisture control. Okay. Chapter 5 is the floor chapter now for concrete slab on grade. We have a whole nother section in a different chapter. And look, the titles like don't really help here. They're not really consistent. Moisture control. Now we get a title, vapor retarder. Now let's move on to chapter 7. Chapter 7 is when we get into wall coverings and how we manage vapor in wall assemblies. And we get a slightly different title, vapor retarders. And notice I'm just driving him the point that even though the IRC is one code book, all supposed to work together, truly it's a little closer to like Frankenstein's monster. It's been pieced and patched together from different people, from different regions over different periods of time. And in the end, you have this human form, but it's a little clunky and disassociated. And truth be told, that is what ends up happening with the IRC. As we can kind of see, yeah, some lack of coordination between these sections that are all speaking to the same thing, vapor management. All right, so we've got underfloor space, we've got concrete slab on grade, we've got walls, and then what about roofs and attic ventilation? Well, it's not just ventilation, it's vapor management, right? Ventilation's the old way, and we can still do today. We'll get into that evolution. But as we can see here, broken out into different parts of the code book, not chapter 11. All right, so what about some science about vapor management? Let's go through that real quick. I'm sure some of you guys already understand this, but some of you may not. So first of all, we have 3 variables essentially in whether we're going to keep water vapor in the air or whether it's going to become liquid form. And when water vapor is just in the air, it's not a negative effect to our structure. When it becomes liquid water, this is when it can have a negative effect to our structure. So first, fundamental to this first variable is the temperature of the air. And in 1992, KBO 1 and 2 family dwelling code, that's when I historically go back, that's when I find that 68 degrees established in our codes. And as many of you are probably aware, chapter 3 of the IRC is going to tell us we have to be able to heat our homes with some details outside of the scope of this course. We have to be able to maintain at least 68 degrees of heating to maintain that temperature. So if that's the minimum allowable temperature in the code, let's just use that for this example, 68 degrees. Next, you have the relative humidity of the air. And I really should say relative humidity, not humidity. But I try my best to keep things somewhat simplified. I'm not a physicist. You guys aren't physicists. If you are, not sure why you're on this webinar. But we need to have some understanding of these things. But, let's not try to get too scientific, right? Keep it simple. But humidity, relative humidity, we get it, right? Like boiling water. If you keep boiling that water on your stove, sooner or later, you're going to have all that water in your air, and you're going to have water vapor in the air. Now, you can go to the ASHRAE handbook, and this is just a clip I took out of their 2016 Handbook of Fundamentals, where it talks about indoor air quality and all these different critters and issues of the human condition related to water vapor in the air. Remember, I said water vapor in the air isn't really affecting our building, but it's absolutely an effect on the humans breathing and living in that air. So if you look at this handbook, it tells you, some things thrive really well in low humidity, some thrive really well in high humidity. And overall, if you look at this, 45% humidity is basically that sweet spot where all these nasty things are at their least. So let's use 45% humidity. And then the third variable is the temperature of the surface, any solid surface. And what's the temperature of that surface where this particular temperature and particular humidity of air is going to touch that surface? And if that surface is at the dew point temperature, based on, again, the humidity and temperature of the air, if it reaches that dew point temperature or it gets colder, then we're going to see liquid water forming. So keeping your surfaces warm is the warmer you can keep your surface, the less likely you're going to hit dew point, right? Because warmer is better in terms of limiting that change to liquid water. So there's this really cool website, dpcalc.org. Again, I'm sure for our PhD scientists, it probably leaves out all kinds of variables, but for basic understanding of building science, I think it's a pretty good tool. And so I adjusted this one to say, all right, at 68-degree air temperature and at 45% relative humidity, the dew point temperature of a surface would be 45 degrees. So if that air at those temperature and humidity hits a surface 45 degrees or colder, that's what we don't want. We're going to see that liquid water forming. All right, so let's jump out of that science now. Obviously, more that could be discussed at that, but that's the basic concept that is going to be a part of all of this vapor discussion. How do we manipulate and control those three variables in different ways to try to keep the water in the air? So I'm going to take you on, again, a boiled down little journey from the 1927 Uniform Building Code into the 2021 IRC, where we are today. And any moment now, the complete 2024 IRC will be ready for us. So first of all, let's say this. Look, physics hasn't changed. Okay, you know, gravity's still gravity, temperature, all the physics hasn't changed. This is a great book I've got in my collection from 1950. Check it out. Condensation control in dwelling construction, like vapor management, condensation control. It's not a new subject, but it's laughable sometimes to me, and in a polite, friendly way, laughable, when people act like this is such a new concept, this idea that we probably need to start thinking about this, right? No, it's not a new concept. So what happened? Like, let's go way back in time, right? We just got this empty wall cavity with some sheathing or siding on the outside and maybe plaster and lath on the inside. And you know what? People for all of time have tried to keep their homes warm. So we got some home inside at, you know, maybe 68 degrees or warmer if the fire's cooking, and we've got a humidity inside. Humans, you know, we change, but not too terribly much. And then outside, the environment in the winter, it's cold and dry, and in the summer, it's hot and humid, or in different parts of the country, right? Whatever. That hasn't changed too terribly much. I mean, you talk about climate change, not today, not here. In general, you get what I'm saying. All right, so what has changed though in time since like the 1950s, let's say? Well, we got polyethylene vapor retarders came on the scene. We get spray foam continuous insulation. Is it open cell? Is it closed cell? We get exterior continuous insulation. That could be a foam. That could be, there's now rock wool products. There are wood fiber products available. Are they vapor open? Are they vapor closed? Are they air permeable? Are they not air permeable? Now cavity insulation comes along. I should have done that one first. That's one of the older ones. How does this affect our temperature moving through this assembly, right? We're affecting temperature here. Is this air open, air permeable? Well, now air also moves temperature and humidity, right? We're affecting all those three variables. What else have we got? Oh, air barriers, right? Big thing now, all the different kind of air barriers. Well, if we stop air from getting in, we've stopped the air from moving that water vapor. It plays a role in all this. What about, okay, now we can do air barriers on both sides, and let's really keep the air from moving into the assembly at all. What else might we see? Smart vapor retarders are on the scene now. I'll talk about those towards the very end of this. And these are ones that are, sometimes they're more permeable, then other times they're not as permeable based on how dry the environment is. Then, oh, hey, you know what else we could do? We could do ventilated cladding. And now ventilated cladding is going to help to lower the humidity level on the outside and help drive that humidity through the assembly. And then, of course, another thing that's come along, right? Hydronuclear vapor implosion. Yeah. I mean, that's like 2030, 2035. But see my point, guys? It's going to keep changing, but what's never changed is the science and fundamentals behind this and the needs of the people and, generally speaking, the environment, right? These people are still going to want that comfortable home, and they're not thinking about the ring of water on their coaster, on their table, right? All of this stuff happening in the walls is not like your dinner table discussion at the potluck, but thermal insulation might be, energy bills might be, draftiness, all the things, right, that affect us as humans. So humans way back a long time ago realized we don't like nasty things in our home. We want comfort, convenience. We want to be pleasant inside of our homes. And so the first time we started trying to control any of this was ventilation of habitable rooms. And this goes way back into the oldest of codes, back to the 1800s. And it was all about windows. If your house was too hot in the summertime, you open the window. If you're cooking something that smells a bunch, or you burnt the bacon, that's what I tend to do, you open the window because it's an uncomfortable environment, right? If you've got moisture, we can go back way back in history. And when we moved outhouses into the water closets inside homes, people realized they were ventilating smells at that point, but we evolved that along to as well ventilating moisture inside the house. So we were familiar with this idea of wanting to control our environment and utilizing a window and utilizing open outside ventilation air to dilute the environment inside that's become unpleasant. Okay. No one's talking about condensation because we had big, massive wood burning fireplaces, and our homes were not made of all these polymer type of technological products. They were natural products that were all generally vapor open. So you had an incredibly hot house drying out any of that potential humidity, no insulation. So it's keeping all the surface temperatures very warm, right? The warmer you keep the surface temperature, the less likely you're going to get condensation. So no one cared. Where might they have noticed condensation? Same place I did when I was in my 20s and bought that 1950s house right there. My single pane glass windows were all condensing and draining down, and I'd get puddles of water on the windowsill. Why? Well, because we know vapor is not going to move through the glass. So we're going to have a higher concentration of relative humidity on this other side of this glass. It's not just going to pass through. And then, of course, the glass is very thermally poor. So it's cold. It's a cold surface. And boom, we get water condensation. Now, people of the past also understood, or began to understand as time went along, why their paint was bubbling off of their houses, off their wood siding. And that's because, well, lo and behold, paint, certain types of paint, will have a lower permeability and function as a vapor retarder. And so that water vapor was moving through these buildings to dry to the outside, and then it was hitting that paint, and the water vapor wasn't able to pass through, raising your relative humidity. And that paint is still a surface, right? It still has a temperature, and so we can still have potential condensation. So here's my house. Just if we want a more recent example of paint as a vapor retarder. This is my 1950s house. This is the corner of my kid's bedroom from many, many years ago. And he's a teenager now, so the stuffed animals have come down. But look at this perfect square of raindrops forming on the ceiling right here. Perfect square. This is a small house with lots of people, lots of dogs, high humidity. Okay. Well, my house is a hip roof. So there's a hip rafter coming down right here. And then there's two jack rafters, shorter little rafters coming off of that hip like this. Now, this is all with conventional wood frame construction. So it's solid pieces of wood. Here's how it would look if it was framed today, just to give you another example. But this is with trusses. You can see that hip truss coming down, and then the two jack trusses on the side. But in the 50s, this is all solid material. Well, I had my attic blown with insulation 20 years ago when I bought the house. And of course, because it's solid materials, they couldn't get any insulation into this corner from the top side. And so I had this square in the corner with no insulation. And now let's go back to my house. Oh, look at that. Nice, perfect square. And so that's exactly what happened. We have paint acting as a vapor retarder that's gonna inhibit the ability for that relative humidity and that moisture, that water vapor, to diffuse through the material and dry outward to the outside. And then compounded with that, we have a higher relative humidity here because it's not able to pass through. And compounded with that, we have an uninsulated surface. So this is the coldest part of the roof, and lo and behold, water forms. All right, so there we go. Now we understand, hopefully, all this science of vapor retarders excuse me, not vapor retarders, dew point temperature and how that all works, vapor management. So going back to the concept that the IRC has these subjects for materials and structures and equipment and occupancy, the IRC is really the most unique code book out there, more unique than any other I codes. And that's because it truly has just the most beautiful history going going all the way back to 1940s, right after that post-World War II time when we had a big need for housing in America. And we said, you know, we need a code book for the people. We need just a recipe book, just like a cookbook that the American people can just take, just like you can make green bean casserole for your family if you can't afford a chef to make you some custom meal or go out to dinner every night. So was the idea that you could build a basic green bean casserole home for your family, and you wouldn't need a chef. You wouldn't need design professionals and engineered trusses. You got this basic recipe to follow. Man, I just love that. And I'm a voice to hold on to that today. The IRC is truly the original affordable housing because it is literally trying to let you build green bean casserole, basic little human shelter for your family. So one way that you should definitely consider looking at the IRC and recognizing that just like a cookbook, you can pick lots of different recipes. Maybe you don't like green bean casserole. You can pick a lot of basic recipes. Granted, I would say the IRC is getting a lot of pretty high level recipes these days. So anyway, way back in the day, we built our houses just right over the dirt and we just had exposed dirt in the crawl spaces. You can still build that way today if you would like. As I say, basically everything in here, all these concepts and methods of vapor control are still in the code today. That's your choice. So everyone has opinions of what they may feel is best or better or what they prefer to do. And then of course your region will affect that as well. So anyway, we had this dirt coming out there. And if any of you have ever, like back when I was a deck builder, I'd leave all my tools out on the job site at the end of the night, out in the yard, all rolled out, all my miter saw, and I just cover them with a tarp because I was working long hours. Come back in the morning and I can get back to it. And what would happen? I would take that tarp off and there's all this water underneath because we have water in the earth and it's diffusing and drying upwards to the open atmosphere. But what was that tarp? That tarp was a cold surface. And so that water coming out of the earth hit that cold tarp and condensed. That's how I learned back as a 20-year-old deck builder about these concepts of vapor. So vapor comes out of the ground and folks back in that day start to notice things like this staining that you see here on the foundations. The foundations are cold, they're at the perimeter, and this was a place that they were seeing condensation occur. Now, this is a more modern picture of an older house, and so what they did back then is similar to what they knew how to do for the habitable spaces, right? Hey, if your kitchen is smoky from burning the bacon, open the windows. If it's hot in the summertime, open the windows. That was something familiar. So that was the concept that originally started as well. Let's ventilate this. Let's just try to dilute this relative humidity in here with a drier relative humidity outside, and we'll try to keep condensation from forming by lowering relative humidity, right? Attacking that one of the variable. Now, if we zoom in on this, you might look and go, wait a minute, hold on, Glenn. That's packed full of insulation. That thing's been completely abandoned and closed off. That's not a very good picture for your example here, Glenn, for ventilation. Well, no, it's a perfect picture for it, right? Because why is that blocked off? Because of those critters right there that just are worried about what drink did they pick and what glass does it in and how comfortable is it to them, not about the coaster and about the water left on the coffee table. So the average occupant is going, this is ridiculous. My energy bills are crazy. My house is cold. Everyone's talking about climate change. Why do I have these openings to the outside? And homeowners go and block them off because they're not thinking about condensation. So 1927 Uniform Building Code. We had ventilation of crawl spaces as a method still today. Now today it's based off square footage. Back then, the original approach, this is science that was figured out by trial and error in a lot of cases. Obviously starting with some theory, but then through trial and error. And we still are doing that today, testing theories in our actual built environment. So originally they thought this was probably better to relate to the foundation perimeter in terms of how much ventilation you needed. Now, here's something I think you might find interesting. In the 1927, it said vents can be omitted from the front side of a building, just saying no vents on the front side of the building. Now, why might that be? Is it because the front side of the building it's not windy on that front side? Is it not on the front side of the building because the air's colder on that side? No, no. You want to know why it wasn't allowed on the front side of the building? It's because they're freaking ugly. See that? Look at that. I mean, they're ugly. Who wants that on the front of their building? No, I mean, that's the true historically researched answer is that, again, who cares about the little ring of water on your coffee table? It'll dry up. Who cares? Vapor management, whatever. I don't want these ugly vents on the front of my brand new home. This is all still the tone we see today, not even just with regular homeowners. A lot of builders out there still have this kind of train of thought, right? Not focusing on the importance of vapor management. Now, we did have vapor retarders. It's just a quick trivia, but not really good for this webinar. But the early vapor retarders in these crawl spaces, that was also a concept. They said, well, we could dilute it with outside air, or we could also reduce the water vapor coming in from the ground. Two different ways to address the relative humidity variable. And so what was it? It was 50-pound rolled roofing. The old books of the past talk about using a 50-pound rolled roofing in your crawl space on the floor. All right, moving along in time, 1930s, 1940s, around that area, fiberglass insulation is invented. Why was it invented? Well, not for vapor management. It was for human comfort and heating cost, right? Obviously. And so in this really rudimentary example of a ceiling assembly, we can see the big red line saying it's wide open. It's just an empty open attic. The heat can just pass right through. That's the red line. The blue line is water vapor in air form, just passing and diffusing, or I mean, in the air and just diffusing through these solid materials. Okay, so that's vapor diffusion going through the materials. And then the third line, the light blue line, is the air that could pass through these. And remember, the air is going to bring both temperature and a relative humidity with it as well. You can move humidity through diffusion through solid materials, much slower method of moving humidity, or you just move it directly on the air. So what happens, right? We come and we throw in this line of insulation across there, and the goal is to reduce the amount of heat loss. We paid for it and we want it for our comfort. That's what we're focused on. So we insulate and we reduce the heat. Now, what did that mean? Now, the heat, that warm, humid air that's in this attic space to hit and to touch the solid surface of that roof sheathing, well, theoretically, we've lowered the temperature of that air, right? It's not, 68 degrees inside, but we're slowing how much that heat can move into this cavity. So we assume we lower the air temperature a little bit, of course. But that also means that air temperature is what was keeping the dew point, the surface where we're going to get condensation occurring. That was the only source of heat for that surface. So while we do reduce air temperature, we're also reducing not the 45 degrees, right? 45 degrees, that dew point temperature is going to come down. It'll take a colder surface to condense to liquid water, if our air is colder. But if our air is colder, it's also going to lower the temperature of that surface. And so it will still continue to lower it. And what was happening? It lowers that down enough that now they're seeing condensation start to occur because we affected the temperature only, again, focused on our comfort. And I just call this the battle of the dew point. It'll come up again in a little bit. And this is where these surfaces, where these solid surfaces where condensation can occur, where we're trying to stay above dew point temperature, we have to think about this in a particular way. We have one side of that surface bringing the heat to that surface. So we want to lose, in a way, some heat from the house. The heat from the house is the only thing that'll keep that surface warmer than dew point, right? But on the other side of that surface, we have the open environment trying to pull the heat away. So if the heat is pulled away faster than the heat can come to it, well, you're going to end up with a surface temperature lower than the dew point temperature. So battle of the dew point. And here's just a photo a friend sent me from the Northeast Massachusetts, where he was showing, yep, I get this condensation on the underside of my roof deck that ends up condensing straight into frost. So building codes always follow society. Society is out there inventing and trying new things, changing our expectations, right? Like, we expect more out of the built environment now than we did in the past. We expect more out of our cars, out of our phones. We're just needy creatures, right? We are out there innovating, creating, doing risky things, coming up with new ideas, creating new problems. And then the building code follows behind us to then try to address those issues. So in all of this history, you'll see typically an invention of a product or a new design concept in the mainstream kind of historical books. And then it takes a couple years, 10, 20 sometimes, for the actual historical code books to then come along and support this. So anyway, what do we see here? Windows, right? So originally it was like, well, we're going to insulate these attics. Now we have affected the temperature of the dew point surface of this condensing surfaces, and condensation is forming. We need to affect something else in the equation. So it was two windows on opposite sides of the attic. That was the original thing. Put in windows in your attic. And that's, hey, we were ventilating crawl spaces to reduce relative humidity and to dilute it with outside air. Let's do it with the attic as well. So that's where we just followed along what we had tried before. I like to point out here, because it's still an issue today in new construction, to get builders to understand when they have a roof ceiling assembly. So your rafter, there's no attic, your rafter is got finished directly on the underside. Each one of those rafter bays, those spaces, has to be ventilated individually. And again, that's not new. I can trace that back to the 1960s in the Southern Building Code. So not a new concept. So yeah, it was windows in the attics and windows, and then it through time transformed into gable end vents like this, because we got out of using windows, went in straight to ventilation. And then now what you'll see is actually decorative gable end vents that don't even function, but have now become an architectural feature. And I just think that's interesting, that architectural feature taking us all the way back to the invention of fiberglass insulation, essentially. So we look at this house. Here's a house in Colorado, and we can see our B vent right here, and we see all that melting snow, and that's normal because that's where we are purposely losing heat in order to create a natural draft and get the combustion products out of our house. That we want to see. But hey, look at these attic vents over here, ventilating the attic. And notice what's happening. This melting snow on there. Oh my gosh. Oh, panic, right? Bring in this critter. Oh my gosh, if there's heat leaving the attic and melting snow, it must be heat that I'm paying for that's supposed to be keeping me comfortable inside. That they're not thinking about ventilation and vapor control. They're just going, why is the snow melting? So what do they'll do? Like run onto Amazon or something, and they'll buy, this cover, turbine roof vent cover. By the way, there is somebody to sell you a product for every problem out there, including ones that don't exist. So be aware of that. That's why I kind of chuckle at this little marketing, because I see it says reduces home heat loss. Yeah, not exactly, because that ventilated attic space should be outside of your building thermal envelope. And there's could be some argument to the delta T if you're keeping the attic a little, this is not about home heat loss. This is misleading the public. But what's going on here, right? The problem is to try to manage vapor and relative humidity of the air, we move the air. But when we're moving the air, we're also moving the heat. And this has become the problem with this. Any ventilation is affecting two of the variables of our equation. In fact, it's affecting all three, because it could also be affecting that temperature of our condensing surfaces. So ventilation is the old way of doing it, still in the code today, but total limited control over the three variables. What else I find interesting here is a statement that says fabric is breathable. And this will come up again in a minute. Granted, I'm running a little short on time. What does breathable mean to you? A lot of people think breathable, and when talking about buildings, is about air movement, because they think of it like us, like we breathe, and we breathe in air and we breathe out air. But if you look at this cover, it's supposed to reduce home heat loss because it stops the ventilation, i.e., it stops the air. So this is something to consider. Maybe breathable is about vapor, not about air. It's about water vapor. So what it's saying is water vapor will move through this. It has high perm rating. It's not a vapor retarder. More will come up on that. So 1973, 91, this is a period of time there because we had 4 different codes at this time, and they all adopted this concept of blocking the vapor in attics at different periods of time. And so this is when our polyethylene came on the scene, and so many more products made from oil and all these, these very chemical based products, where we're starting to manipulate and affect perm ratings now, as opposed to all the natural products we used to use. So this was the idea, similar to the crawl space, that rolled roofing I said, that would go on the floor. And this concept was, hey, let's put a vapor retarder and let's block the vapor coming into the attic. And that's part of how we can reduce that relative humidity, as well as our ventilation. So another way to affect relative humidity. Come along in the 70s, and now we get introduced to energy codes, and federal government starts supporting energy codes. We're still, and that train hasn't stopped. That's why we're here today talking about energy codes. And this was all about saving money, staying warm, and this mandatory insulation discussion. But if you look at these model energy codes and these energy codes of the past, no discussion of this. This is a different issue, right? This is in the materials section of the 1940s book, not the occupant comfort portion. And so unfortunately, this little thing was just kind of left with little attention. Come along to the 2000 IRC, and now we start getting mandated discussions in the code about air barriers and about mandatory vapor retarders in all assemblies. And this was one of our big mistakes of the past. So our underfloor, our crawl space assembly, ventilated. We've been doing that. Our attic assemblies, ventilated. We've been doing that. We try vapor retarders as a way to maybe not have to ventilate as much. And then this comes along and says, all right, if you don't ventilate, you have to put the vapor retarder. And since we don't generally, there's really not a lot of designs out there historically, or even today, for ventilated wall assemblies within the cavity, we saw vapor retarders just getting thrown out there everywhere. And what happened? Well, what happens is the vapor retarders were stopping water vapor from diffusing into the wall. But what about the air barriers? There wasn't a ton of focus put on the air barriers. There wasn't any air testing at that time. And so air was still leaking into these cavities, and the air just brings the humidity with it, kind of bypassing the vapor retarder. Here's an example of a 1950s house with a piece of insulation. This was during a remodel, and you look at the amount of dirt in here. So you can see, just as an example, the amount of air moving within these building thermal envelopes. And so until air barriers get more serious, we had this issue of vapor barriers, vapor retarders end up becoming a worse thing, because even though they don't let the humidity come into the assembly, the air leakage just passes around them. And then now that vapor retarder works negatively. It doesn't, it keeps the water inside the assembly, doesn't let it dry back outwards. So we found some big issues when we jumped into this 2000 code, with not thinking about air movement, vapor movement, and thermal movement as one discussion together. 2000 was the first code where energy got implanted directly into the code now, as opposed to being a standalone code. So we see that's about the time that we start to see the attention ramp up. We can look at the air leakage back in that time, and if we read this, what we'll notice is it's the same as today. It's speaking about air leakage through the assembly, completely through the assembly, from the cold outside to the warm inside. As long as it doesn't get through the whole assembly, you're good. But no discussion about the air that gets into the assembly, right? And why is that? Because air barriers are all about keeping these critters over here happy. We're all so focused on comfort and energy costs that we think we don't want the warm inside air to go outside. I paid for that. So blower door test. Okay, it's not going outside. Well, but if your air gets inside the assembly, that's we get condensation, right? But historically, no one was talking about that. Well, not true, as I can say. I can take you back to the 1950s book on condensation control, and I just got to read this to you because this is meant to pick up on the breathing discussion of that turbine roof vent cover. What does it say here about sheathing paper? Sheathing paper, sometimes called breathing paper, between the sheathing and the finished siding has been customarily used to reduce air infiltration of cold air. Hey, that sounds like air barriers 1950. And to prevent the penetration of wind-driven rain, right? But breathing paper, this means that it's vapor open. That's what the discussion has been since, again, the 50s. In order that as little restriction as possible to release the moisture that might be built into the wall, it's recommended that the sheathing paper and sheathing be of types that will readily transmit water vapor, as in high permeable products. I just chuckle at that. That's why I want to read you that history. These are subjects we've known about forever. We're just finally, I think, mainstream starting to get more attention to them. So, like I said, 1927 UBC, you've got this foundation or underfloor crawl space ventilation comes into play. Can still do it today, still in the code today, right? And it would look like this. Now, of course, we're going to have our insulated floor cavity. You've got that water vapor coming out of the ground. You're going to dilute it with outside air, with vents to the outside air. You can put a vapor retarder down, and now you can do slightly less ventilation, because ventilation dilutes the relative humidity down, and vapor retarders limit how much humidity comes into the space to begin with. So they're hand in hand. But there's new options that came on board, like conditioned crawl spaces, unvented crawl spaces. And as you can see now, we've insulated down inside that foundation. So what do we do there? For one thing we do is we're insulating those cold surfaces. So we're covering those cold surfaces. And then more importantly, what we're doing here is we're diluting the air, but instead of with outside air, we're just diluting it with the rest of the air inside the house. So one way to do this would be to provide a conditioned air supply to that crawl space with a path back to the rest of the house. And so we're getting the dilution there. And since it's open to the house, our thermal envelope wraps around it to keep us warm, to keep our energy bills low, but also is insulating those cold surfaces. The other way you could do that would be with an exhaust-only system. And this is a system where now you would have minimal level of exhaust pushing the air out of the house and drawing your conditioned air from within the house. And now what we're diluting it with the inside air as opposed to the outside air. Moving along in time to the 2009 code, and folks start thinking slightly different about this and going, hey, when we went with unvented crawl spaces, we pulled our thermal envelope around that crawl space. And now we can start to control the temperature of surfaces. If we did that in the attic and we did insulation up at the roof level of the attic, now we can control the temperature of that attic. We're essentially now insulating not for the comfort of the owner only, but we're insulating now so that we don't get condensation. So this is where we get that concept of insulation as vapor control, not just thermal warminess for our toes. And so if you look at this, what we would be affecting now is not the actual, what the dew point temperature is, what mathematically the temperature where dew point would come to become water, or where vapor would become water. We're addressing the physical surface, and we're going to control the temperature of that physical surface so it never hits that magical dew point temperature or colder. So this could be like a spray foam inside. It could be a continuous on the top of the roof. What also came along in that same year, 2009, was, hey, if we can do that for the attic space, can't we do that for the walls as well? And could we now control the temperature of the inside of the sheathing with like continuous exterior insulation, or hybrid use of spray foam on the inside with air permeable to finish out your R value for thermal comfort? And so we might now start to get a mix of R value not in Chapter 11 for the sake of vapor control, and other R values in Chapter 11 for the sake of low energy bills and warm toes. So what happens though now, right? If we've been putting these vapor retarders on and we start throwing continuous insulation on the outside, a lot of it, which is a foam, which is a vapor retarder, a lot of it being closed cell foam. And now what we've done is created a vapor retarder on both sides. And what we get is the dreaded vapor sandwich. Notice that 1950s book saying, ideally, you have materials that can dry outward, that can dry to at least one or the other side. Now with air conditioning, we can create conditions where we dry towards the inside. And so this was no good. And so this is where we've seen a movement now to say, hey, we can't, we're really having a hard time keeping the water vapor from getting in the walls. Like, we would like to say we're perfect and we can just keep it all out, but we can't. We're still getting condensation inside because of air leakage, right? And even with your tightest energy code house meeting energy code, remember that air leakage does not measure what's going on inside the envelope. It's only measuring from one side to the other side. So it's up to the building environment to say, what's happening with the air that gets in the assembly? Well, basically recognizing that trying to just block that from happening by stopping the water from getting in there is kind of a losing battle. And so the code, we're seeing a switch and a movement now to say, maybe stopping it from getting wet isn't the best goal. Maybe what we should do is accept it's going to get wet and we need to allow it to dry. And so that's where this concept comes along in our cold climates, like here in Colorado, where you could go with a class 3 vapor retarder on the inside, forget the poly, forget the paper. Yes, more is going to move into the wall assembly. So what happens now? Two bad things, two reds are no good. A red, high relative humidity, because we have a very, very weak vapor retarder. And now it's going to hit the inside of that exterior sheathing, which is a low surface temperature. And man, we're going to get liquid water. That's what we don't want. So this table comes along with ways to try to affect one of these variables. To say, all right, if you use continuous insulation on the outside, you can now control this surface temperature. And now we can increase that surface temperature because we're not losing the heat through it so quickly, right? Because there's insulation. And so now we've turned one of these reds green, and that's enough to reduce probability of liquid water. But if it still forms, good thing we got a class 3 vapor retarder on one side, and it has the potential to dry because, again, drying is the goal at this point. So as we can see here, right, if we have a class 3 inside, it can dry to the inside. We put an insulation on the outside. Hey, maybe it can't dry to the outside now, right? Maybe because it's a closed cell insulation. Maybe it's open cell. But what do we have here? We can see that we've got a high relative humidity. Since we aren't talking about the permeability of that continuous exterior, it could be a closed cell, very low perm rating, a class 1. Well, that means we're going to get a buildup of more, we're going to get a higher relative humidity behind that sheathing because it's not going to be able to pass through, right? Well, no problem. Good thing we have a high surface temperature because we've slowed the heat leaving the dew point surface. We've slowed down the heat that's leaving. And if we slow down the heat leaving it, it means we can heat more heat on it, right? And so that's where we get a high surface temperature. And this is meant to reduce probability of liquid water. But what happens now? Hey, let's get thermally more comfortable. Let's increase the cavity insulation. We want to build above code maybe, or maybe that's just what we have to build to meet thermal comfortable requirements, Chapter 11 insulation requirements. Well, what did we do now? Now we have increased the insulation, bringing the heat to that condensing surface. So we're not going to get as much heat now coming to that condensing surface. But notice, we didn't change how rapidly the heat moves away from that condensing surface. And so what might happen now? We have a lower surface temperature there, and we're no longer above dew point temperature. And so what's the lesson that we see here? If we increase the cavity insulation, we're going to probably have to increase the exterior insulation. And this is because of that battle of the dew point, as I talk about, where we got to balance the heat coming to it to keep it above dew point and balance it with the heat being pulled away from it. And this is where, when we look at that table, you'll see that you need more continuous when you have a 2x6 wall versus a 2x4 wall, and it's assuming you're filling that cavity completely with insulation. Another way that we might be able to manage this, hey, what about that drying? What if we do, I said there's no ventilated wall assemblies, but there kind of is now, but not in the same way we ventilate within an attic or we ventilate within the crawl space. This is ventilating on the outside of the wall assembly. I mean, it's still all the assembly, but you know what I'm saying? The outside of the structural assembly. and it's ventilating behind the exterior cladding. And what this does is help to promote outward drying. This is a different approach. The insulation approach said, all right, let's try to control surface temperature. This approach says, hey, we've got this class 3 vapor retarder on the inside. That means we're going to have a higher relative humidity in that wall cavity. That's not so good. And we don't have continuous insulation, so we have a low surface temperature inside that sheathing. That's not so good. So the other choice you can do here in our climate zone, you can see above the insulation choice, is ventilated cladding. And what this does is it says, hey, instead of that water vapor moving through the interior class 3 vapor retarder, moving into the assembly, then it hits this exterior that may be a vapor retarder, and that's going to start to slow down our vapor movement through. And that's what it's going to be. It means we're collecting that humidity on the other side where it can now liquefy. So what this does is it promotes vapor drive through the assembly. It keeps that vapor, hey, don't stop and condense. Keep on moving through. There's not enough relative humidity for you to condense, because we gave you a path to get right through the sheathing and get out to that ventilated cladding. And so this would affect our relative humidity. So real quick, I'm right at time, but if I can have, I'll have to ask my host, Erica. I'm at that 1 o'clock time. I've hit you guys, but I have just a few more things I would love to wrap up.
Yeah, that's fine, Glenn.
Might take
Go
about
for
10
it.
more minutes. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. I love that answer. Okay. So, all right, we went with the class 3 on the inside, like a paint, perhaps, right? We get rid of the paper, get rid of the poly. We're too worried about that condensation. We got to be able to dry. And so we have this class 3 that can dry to the inside. And like I said, now that means a higher relative humidity is coming into that assembly. So what do? Let's attack that variable. Let's try to fix that. Let's put this ventilated cladding on the outside, and let's help push that higher relative humidity coming in, and let's not back it up. Let's just let it run all the way through and dry to the outside. Now we've lowered it, and look, our 2 reds, 1 became green. If both of those could become green, we'd probably guarantee to never see condensation. But notice how I've explained this in both the concept of insulation or ventilated cladding. Both of them are not guaranteed to stop water vapor from condensing, but they lower the probability significantly. And then in the case that it does condense, what happens? We have drying potential, right? That's the goal. All right. Moving along in time, 2018 IRC. Hey, we got these 3 variables and we're trying to manage this with the free open environment. But here we are in this world of technology where we can just say to the air, condense now. I'm missing the word I'm looking for. I tell you now, air, you will release your water. Yes, we have the power of humans to do that. And we've always kind of thought that we might have this power. Because if I go back, I can find a 1960 code book that talks about ventilation to dilute the humidity, but it also says, or other approved means. And then in 1965 code says, or you can use mechanical methods, right? Well, now we have those mechanical methods. We have the magic to have the power to tell the air what to do. My friends, wield this power in dehumidification appliances, right? Technology, it's another way to deal with it. Instead of waiting around for ventilation from the outside, or what's the temperature, how much insulation, but oh, it's a really cold day, oh, and it's Thanksgiving and I have tons of family, so we're having a peak high humidity moment, and now our relative humidity is way higher than any of this. None of it matters. Just force the humidity right out of the air. Just own it, man. I mean, we're humans, right? So there's another method. I'm just trying to be a little fun about it. But yes, as we continue to invent and come up with ways, the code follows behind. It's not like dehumidification was invented in 2018. It's been around a long time, but it finally gets in the code, 2018. What else comes in 2018? Well, comes in, remember I talked about that sheathing paper. I can take you back to that 1950s book where it talks about sheathing paper, like our tar paper on our walls, being called breathing paper. And that's because historically, without ASTM tests, people figured out that the permeability, the ability for water vapor to move through the sheathing paper changes when it's a dry condition versus a really, really wet condition. And the permeability of that material is not constant. It's not the same. And turns out a lot of materials are like that. And turns out we can develop and invent and create materials. And so we have this test standard, ASTM E96. This is for testing vapor permeability of materials. And there's two methods of this test. There's a dry cup method, which is in a dry environment. And under that method, that's what gets us our vapor retarder classes, class 1, class 2, class 3, which I didn't get into detail in this presentation. But one being our poly, 2 being the paper, 3 being paint, right? More permeability as the number goes up. But there's another way to do this same test, and it's the wet cup method. And now it tests permeability of materials in a wet condition. And what they find is, yes, there are some materials that might be a class 1 under the dry cup, and so they're labeled a class 1 vapor retarder. But turns out, that air leaked around, turns out we did get liquid water condensing in the walls. Now it's a lot more humid. It's a lot wetter environment. Guess what? The permeability of those materials change, and this now promotes drying. And this is a direction that's very interesting because it really attacks the exact issues, right? That we want vapor retarders to work when we're trying to stop the movement of vapor from going where we don't want it to go. But lo and behold, once it gets somewhere that we didn't want it to go, and now we have a liquid water problem or a high humidity problem, boy, it'd sure be nice if that vapor retarder would open up and let it dry back out. And that's what we see that came along in 2018. A lot of codes discussing if your vapor retarder is also under this ASTM E96 wet cup class B method, then the rules change slightly different, which is appropriate, right? As we develop new technologies, the code says, hey, let's recognize these different things. And another big thing that occurred, this isn't for our cold climates, this is for your warmer climates, but I know you're Colorado, but I still wanted to share it with you because I'm about building you up as a professional individually. And it's all part of this subject, is the idea of vapor ventilation. This came along in 2018 to say, this idea of moving air in order to reduce relative humidity is kind of problematic because we're also moving heat with it and we're moving air with it when really we just want to lower relative humidity. So what this concept does is it says, let's put like a roof vent, kind of like this. That's an attic vent for air, but let's do similar to that, but we'll do a vapor diffusion port. And so air does not actually get out of that vent because you have a solid material over it, but it's a very vapor open material so that the water vapor can naturally just come and diffuse out of it. Building Science Corp is a big, I'm pretty sure they've created this method. Joe Stiebrick, a name some of you may recognize. You can get lots of more details on this from those professionals. But the reason I bring this up too is it speaks back to what I had talked about here with this Amazon marketing, right? Fabric is breathable. This is kind of almost, to me, hitting on that same concept. Let's keep the air from ventilating out because people think that'll reduce the heat loss in their home. Oh, okay. But hey, it's breathable, so we still get vapor diffusion. Okay. All right. One other thing I want to mention to you about under slab. There was a big change from 2018 IRC to 2021 IRC, and this is for the vapor retarder underneath concrete slabs. Historically, going back to like the 2003 code, it was a 6 mil polyethylene vapor retarder. So, right, you had your plastic, your 6 mil polyethylene plastic going underneath of concrete slab on grade. 2021 code, this changed to now say it needs to be a 10 mil vapor retarder, so a more robust vapor retarder, and it needed to be compliant to this ASTM standard. However, I wouldn't grasp onto this too quickly because in the 2024 code, it went straight back to the way it was before with the 6 mil. So FYI, to my public out there, to the building authorities, if you're on the 21, I would consider that, hey, look, that might have been a bleep on the radar because in 2024, it goes right back to 6 mil. And then for the public out there, that you may want, if your building department's on the 21 and is requiring this, you may want to say, hey, did you guys notice it changed again? Can we still utilize this? Or maybe your building department hasn't adopted the 2021 yet, and you can speak up. And to my public on the line, I love to let you guys know, it is not us against them. Your building departments are not against you. We are a team in construction for society. And you need, if you don't feel like you have a say in codes in your community, I encourage you to pay closer attention to your community. Because look, here's just some clips. Here's from last year, Pikes Peak Regional Building Department. They're excellent in their social media. They put out notice after notice after notice asking the public, the citizens that they serve, what are your opinions about this code? Denver did the same thing, even more so. Denver opens it up to the public. You can write proposals and submit it to Denver. So always remember, guys, you have a voice to share with your building department. We are all in this together. So I like to mention that table I showed you for insulation or vapor or cladding ventilation in order to allow the class 3 vapor retarder. Well, someone spoke up in Denver and showed information and validation to say, hey, our relative humidity here is low enough that we can do class 3 vapor retarders, and we don't really need this table with the ventilation or the continuous. And guess what? They were able to say, and Denver said, hey, I think we agree with you in the committee and through the whole process. And so by that member of the public speaking up from their local real field experience, they were able to go back and say, hey, theoretically, this is great, but in our experience, it's not necessary. So great reason why you should speak up and be a part and participate in code in your communities. And then finally, a little tip of what's coming for 2024. As I said, in 2018, we got this concept of the wet cup versus the dry cup, and everywhere throughout the code that it would refer to allowing this type of material that has different permeability during dry or cold or wet conditions. Every part of the code, it had to say, when tested in accordance with ASTM E96 method B, blah, 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 blah. Well, someone said, let's give a definition to that. And so now we have officially created a term for this in the IRC. It's called a responsive vapor retarder. A lot of people out there in the public have been calling it a smart vapor retarder. You'll hear that term, I'm sure, for many years or decades to come. But starting in the 2024, there is a codified term for that in the definitions, which is a responsive vapor retarder. And then now it can explain that when it's a class 1 or 2 under this test versus under this test. And every time that appears in the code now, it'll simply say responsive vapor retarder. You guys, thank you so much for letting me go a little bit over time with you. I know this was a fast-moving presentation. As I say, I like to I don't like to just read the code to you. I like to teach it. I like to get into the weeds. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Glenn. That was great. I really enjoyed the images that you shared to really create a visualization of it all. So it's super helpful. We've got one question in the chat. Well, I guess the first question is, continuing education credits will be sent out next week. That's automatic if you've registered and attended the session. So just as a heads up. For a question from an attendee I've got here from Andy. If anyone else has questions, feel free to write that in the Q&A as well, or follow up in our helpline and I'll assign the question to Glenn. But our typical wall assembly on custom residential homes includes from exterior to interior, zip R6 sheathing, 2x6 framing, 1 or 2 inch of closed cell polyurethane insulation, and 3.5 to 4.5 of blown in fiberglass insulation, 1/2 inch of GWB, latex wall plank. We don't usually use a class 3 vapor retarder on the inside face of the studs. Is that okay? And then you're followed up saying we are using paint as a class 3.
Yeah. So, and that's it. Yep. So the way I was going to first answer that was saying, obviously, so my lane is building codes, and I always like to stay in my lane. And so from a building code standpoint, you have to have some type of vapor retarder on the inside, 1, 2, or 3. So you have to have a class 3 vapor retarder. And then as I think you might have answered the question yourself there, is paint often acts as a class 3 vapor retarder. Now, I'll show my ignorance here, because that's like what we should all do, and never be afraid of our ignorance. That's what can make us learn more. And I'm certainly going to learn as soon as this is over. I'm going to go Google this myself and look at some examples. I'm not a complete expert in all of the different materials out there. I'm not a designer and I'm not a contractor. So naturally, those folks should have more knowledge of the available materials on the market and what the performance ratings of those materials are. So what I can stress to you is, I'm not sure what my ignorance is. I'm not sure if latex paint, I know there are some paints, a type of paint that immediately is a vapor retarder. I believe it might be the latex paint. I have some learning still to do on some specifics of material. But I'm not the one buying the paint or designing the paint. You are. And so what you need to do is find out the performance specifications of all the products you're using. Everything that you listed there, from the zip material to the foam to the filled insulation. Understand not just the R value of these, understand the vapor permeability of these materials. And then for that paint, find out if your paint is a class 3 vapor retarder. That means it's going to be more than 1 perm up to 10 perms is a class 3. And so that would be the answer.
Good, thanks, Glenn. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions, but as I said before, that helpline is there for you guys to take advantage of and can be accessed through the Colorado Energy Office's Code Adoption Toolkit. So we hope that you'll join us for, I believe we have another presentation next week, and that's on Passive House. So we hope to see you there, but thanks again, Glenn, for the great presentation, and thank you all for attending today. All right, have a good rest of your day.